Crowds looting the Prime Minister's residence in Bangladesh, a parliament building being torched in Nepal, or protesters jumping on the bed of the President of Sri Lanka. Young people have been rising up across South Asia in a movement many are now calling the South Asian Spring, in reference to the Arab Spring that saw governments across North Africa toppled. In the last few weeks, young Asians in Indonesia and Nepal have overthrown or shaken those in office, with demonstrations in Jakarta growing after a young delivery driver who was found himself in the middle of a police crackdown on a protest was killed by an armoured vehicle. Well, to get more insight into the reasons behind those protests and the strength of them, we can speak now to senior researcher at the Centre for International Research here in France, Mr. David Cambrou. Thanks for your time and joining us here on France 24. Can I start by asking you to tell us a bit more about what is bringing these young people to protest in such numbers?
Well, there are immediate causes and there are underlying causes. The immediate causes, for example, in the case of Indonesia, were an attempt by the President Prabowo, to allow the military to take on civilian roles. There was a fear in Indonesia that this was a return to the dictatorship of President Suharto, his former father-in-law, which ended in 1998. So there's this underlying concern in Indonesia about the return of the military. But overall, as in Indonesia, as in Nepal, the underlying cause has to do with the aspirations of a younger generation. In Nepal, the unemployment rate is about 21% amongst young people. That's similar in Indonesia. Many young people are in the informal economy. And what has occurred, what is different this particular time, is we now have a more educated, younger population whose aspirations are being thwarted. They're better educated, but they can't find the kind of jobs that are commensurate with their educational level and their educational skills. And there's sort of no way of getting out of this. In the case of the Philippines, where there have also been protests, young Filipinos tend to immigrate. 10% of the Filipino population lives overseas. That's not the case in Indonesia nor in Nepal. So there's not that possibility. Plus the aggravation by what they see as an out-of-touch elite who are corrupt, who are, have lavish lifestyles. So this disparity between the aspirations of young people and what they see as an out-of-touch, corrupt elite only requires a small kind of spark to lead to massive protests. We occurred in Indonesia with the killing of a equivalent of a Uber driver. In Nepal, it occurred when they banned social media. The government banned social media and tried to get the military to intervene. The authorities don't really know how to deal with this sort of younger generation in an area of social media where there's a possibility of communicating with each other, which didn't exist decades ago.
We did see an initial crackdown on most protests, and that just seemed to embolden this young generation rather than silence them.
That's right, because it brought back memories of things we'd rather turn the page on. In Indonesia, the overthrow of the Suharto regime in 1998, where it also involved the killing of students. So that aggravates the protests. I mean, when you create martyrs in an inflammatory situation, you really are looking for trouble.
Do you think that these protests, I mean, we've seen a number of leaders stepping down, but do you think they'll lead to real change in these countries?
If there are ways of political expression, for example, in Thailand, there is a political movement which seems to represent young people, now called the People's Party, used to call it. It's a failure to see that the political system as such can offer solutions. So if there can be found a way within the existing political system for the aspirations of the younger generation to be heard and for them to be represented, then things may calm down. But if the only way of dealing with protests is simply through repression, then the situation can only worsen.
You mentioned there briefly the use of social media to these young people. Can you tell us a bit more about the impact that's having on these demonstrations?
Well, in the case of Nepal, there was an attempt to ban social media, and then the government had to sort of backtrack on that. In the case of Indonesia, and particularly in the Philippines, which are incredibly, the links on social media are incredibly strong in those countries. And so the ability to communicate and to organize through social media is something we're seeing also in France that changes the whole the nature of perhaps not the nature of demonstrations, but the level of involvement in demonstrations is far greater because of the capacity to be able to bring people together through social media.
Mr. David.
Also, the conveying of messages and images, of course, the killing of this driver example in Jakarta, that it also through social media that inflames the situation as well.
Indeed, Mr. David Cameron, we'll have to leave it there, but thanks so much for your time.